Great Britain. The very name drips with pride, great as though it were ordained by destiny. Yet, behind the pageantry of kings, the Union Jack fluttering in the wind, and the nostalgia for empire, lies a harsher truth. This island has been conquered as often as it has conquered. It has built its wealth on the backs of others while convincing itself that it was a beacon of freedom. What is Britain really? A cradle of democracy and industry, or the world's most successful empire of plunder? How much of its greatness was earned, and how much was taken? This is not the comforting tale found in school textbooks or royal pageants. This is a story of survival through invasion, of kings who murdered for power, of empires that enriched the island while starving millions abroad. It is a story of a nation that has often confused domination with destiny, and one that still struggles with the ghosts of its own past. Britain likes to think of itself as an island fortress, unbroken and unconquerable. School children are taught that the nation has stood alone against enemies, that it has never been successfully invaded since 1066. But this neat tale of defiance conceals a harsher truth. For most of its early history, Britain was not a fortress at all. It was a prize to be taken, a vulnerable outpost repeatedly trampled by outsiders who left their mark in blood, language, and law. The story begins long before the Age of Kings. After the last ice age, when melting glaciers raised the seas, Britain broke from the European mainland. The land bridge that had once connected it to the continent vanished beneath the waves. Yet, isolation did not mean immunity. Migrations continued. Farmers crossed the water, bringing livestock and crops. Megalithic builders raised monuments on Salisbury Plain, great stone circles aligned to the sun. Today we look at Stonehenge with awe, but in its own time it was less a marvel than a marker of contest. It was proof that Britain had always been a meeting ground of peoples, never a closed island with a single destiny. The Romans were the first great conquerors. In AD 43, under Emperor Claudius, legions landed on Britain's shores. They fought their way inland, founding cities like Londinium and Camulodunum. Resistance was fierce. Queen Boudica of the Iceni led an uprising in 60 AD, torching Roman towns and slaughtering thousands of settlers. Her rebellion was crushed, her people massacred. Roman vengeance was merciless, but their hold on Britain remained insecure. Hadrian's Wall, stretching coast to coast, was less a symbol of Rome's power than of its limits. It declared that the empire could not conquer all of Britain, only contain it. The Roman occupation left deep marks, roads that stitched together the landscape, bathhouses and amphitheaters that spoke of Mediterranean culture, and above all, taxation. Roman Britain was not a gift of civilization freely given. It was a province exploited to feed the empire. When the legions finally withdrew in the early 5th century, the island was left exposed once more. Into this vacuum came the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They arrived not as conquerors in shining armor, but as waves of migrants and raiders who carved out new kingdoms. From their tongues, Old English emerged. From their customs, a new political order took shape. They pushed native Britons to the edges, to the mountains of Wales, the highlands of Scotland, and across the sea to Ireland and Brittany. What we call England is in truth the land of these Germanic newcomers, forged in the displacement of older peoples. But even their dominion was fragile. From the late 8th century, longships darkened the horizons. Vikings from Scandinavia descended upon Britain, sacking monasteries, burning villages, and seizing slaves. The raid on Lindisfarne in 793 shocked Christendom. Monks slaughtered, treasures looted, holy places desecrated. The Norse were more than raiders. They became settlers, carving out the Danelaw across the north and east of England. Their place names still scatter the map: York, Grimsby, Derby. The English language absorbed their words: sky, law, knife, husband. Far from being untouched, Britain's very speech was reshaped by these outsiders. And then came the most decisive blow of all. 1066. The Battle of Hastings is remembered as a national turning point, the moment when the Normans secured the crown of England. The arrow that struck King Harold down is etched into legend. William the Conqueror triumphed not simply because of his knights, but because England was divided and vulnerable. Within months, Norman castles rose across the landscape. Towering fortresses of stone became permanent reminders of submission. School books once told this story as a triumph, the birth of a strong monarchy and modern governance. The Domesday Book, completed in 1086, is still described as a pioneering record, as though it were an early census showing administrative genius. But what was it really? A nationwide tax roll. A cold, meticulous inventory of land, livestock, and human obligation, compiled so that William could squeeze every ounce of wealth from his new possession. To the peasants whose lives it catalogued, it was not progress. It was proof of conquest, a record of subjugation. The Normans transformed England into what was, in effect, a colony of France. For centuries after Hastings, English kings spoke French, governed in French, and ruled over a population that remained mostly Anglo-Saxon in blood, but subject to a foreign elite. The English peasantry did not suddenly grow freer under Norman law. They bent their backs under the same obligations, only now to lords who cursed them in another tongue. Yet, out of this humiliation came identity. The English language itself is the child of conquest, a fusion of Anglo-Saxon, Norse, and French. The English legal system, vaunted for its continuity, is in fact a product of Norman reordering. The myth of sturdy independence masks a history of dependence, resilience, and survival. Here lies the first great contradiction in Britain's history. The nation that would later boast of never being conquered was built out of conquest after conquest. The very features it celebrates, its language, its law, its monarchy, are legacies of foreign domination. When Britain calls itself great, what is it celebrating? The brilliance of survival, or the fact that it was shaped by subjugation? It is tempting to see these invasions as steps on a ladder toward nationhood, each wave contributing something valuable. That is the comforting view, but it also silences the reality of violence. Rome left behind roads, yes, but also mass executions. The Anglo-Saxons left language, yes, but also the displacement of Celtic peoples. The Normans left castles, yes, but also a legacy of feudal oppression that endured for centuries. Greatness, if we call it that, was not freely given. It was extracted at a cost. This early history, often smoothed into a tale of progress, was in truth chaotic, brutal, and humiliating. Britain was not a singular, destined power. It was a patchwork island repeatedly bent to the will of others. The strength it later displayed on the world stage did not come from isolation or purity. It came from the hard lessons of being conquered, of adapting, and of surviving foreign domination. The contradiction is stark. Britain's national myth insists on defiance, yet its origins lie in submission. It proclaims liberty, yet its foundation was feudal bondage. It claims unity, yet its earliest centuries were defined by fracture. The so-called island fortress was less a stronghold than a crossroads, shaped again and again by those who came to take it. This is the uncomfortable truth at the root of Britain's story. Its greatness, if we insist on using the word, was not born from independence, but from defeat. Before Britain could rule others, it had to endure rule itself. Before it built an empire, it was an empire's prey. Only by facing this truth can we understand what came after the rise of kings, the forging of an empire, and the illusions that continue to shape Britain's sense of itself today. If Chapter 1 was a story of Britain as the conquered, Chapter 2 is a story of Britain turning conquest inward, the conquest of faith, the conquest of conscience, the conquest of its own people by kings who cloaked ambition in the name of religion. The 16th century did not just change England, it tore it apart. and at the center of it all stood a monarch remembered less for statesmanship than for his appetites. Henry VIII, the second Tudor king, is often remembered in caricature, a bloated tyrant with 6 wives and a gluttonous table. Yet his personal crisis reshaped the island's destiny more than any battle. His desperation for a male heir, his refusal to accept papal authority, created the break with Rome. School books present this as national liberation, a bold step that freed England from medieval superstition and set it on the path to modernity. But was it really liberation or a cynical gamble by a monarch who prized dynasty above devotion? The story begins with Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Years passed, but no surviving son arrived. Obsessed with securing his line, Henry petitioned Pope Clement VII for an annulment. When the Pope refused, bound by politics and Catherine's royal family ties, Henry acted as only a king who brooked no opposition could. He broke with Rome. In 1534, the Act of Supremacy declared Henry head of the Church of England. Overnight, 1,000 years of spiritual authority was torn up. This was no gentle transition. It was a revolution from the top, enforced with fire and sword. The monastery's centers not only of worship, but of learning, charity, and social order were dissolved. Their lands confiscated, their treasures looted, their monks cast adrift. Centuries of continuity were smashed to fund the crown. To Henry's supporters, this was necessary reform, cleansing the land of corruption. But to the poor who had depended on monasteries for alms, it was devastation. To the faithful who clung to Rome, it was heresy enforced at the point of a blade. And the violence did not stop there. Those who resisted, like Sir Thomas More, were beheaded. Pilgrimages of protest in the north were crushed with executions and mutilations. The English Reformation was not a flowering of freedom, but an act of state terror disguised as reform. Henry enriched his nobles and secured his authority, but left behind a kingdom divided, suspicious, and bleeding. His heirs inherited the chaos. Edward VI pushed Protestantism harder, introducing new prayer books, but died young. Mary I, devoutly Catholic, swung the pendulum back, burning Protestants at the stake in scenes so horrific they earned her the name Bloody Mary. Elizabeth I then reversed course again, entrenching Protestant identity but tolerating Catholicism only so long as it remained silent and underground. Beneath the glitter of Elizabeth's court, the Shakespearean plays, the voyages of Drake, the paintings of Gloriana smoldered a nation in fear of denunciation, a nation where the wrong faith could mean the flames. The Elizabethan settlement is often praised as a triumph of moderation, but it was moderation enforced by spies and gallows. Catholics were seen as traitors, Protestant radicals as threats. The state's grip tightened. The church became an arm of the monarchy, a tool of surveillance as much as salvation. Was this the birth of religious freedom or the death of it? Across the Irish Sea, the Tudors turned their religious gamble into conquest. Ireland, long unruly, became the proving ground for English brutality. Rebellions were crushed with massacres. Plantations of Protestant settlers replaced native landholders. The same methods later used in America, India, and Africa were tested first in Ireland. Seize, dispossess, colonize, suppress. For Ireland, the Tudor Reformation was not theology, it was invasion, and the scars of it endure to this day. Yet even as England ripped itself apart, the seeds of empire were sown. Religion became a weapon, a justification for expansion. Spain and England clashed not merely as rivals but as chosen nations of God. When Philip II sent the Armada in 1588, Elizabeth's victory was hailed as divine deliverance. In reality, it was weather, naval tactics, and Spanish miscalculation. But myth hardened quickly. Protestant England had stood against Catholic tyranny. This narrative, forged in the fires of Tudor upheaval, would echo for centuries in the New World, in Africa, in Asia, wherever Britain cast itself as God's chosen bringer of order against backwardness. The Tudor century is remembered as the dawn of greatness, the flowering of the Renaissance, the first stirrings of Britain as a global power. But its foundation was not noble principle. It was fear, coercion, and bloodshed. Henry VIII did not free his people. He bound them to a monarchy that could dictate their very prayers. Elizabeth did not create tolerance, she enforced conformity. The Tudors' greatness, if it can be called that, was not in liberating Britain, but in forging a state strong enough to dominate its people and, eventually, others. The controversial question is this: when Britain celebrates the Reformation as the birth of independence, is it really celebrating freedom? Or is it celebrating the moment the monarchy perfected its control, the moment a king's desire became the nation's destiny? For centuries, the myth of Tudor glory has blinded Britain to its darker truths. Behind Henry's towering portrait lies a kingdom fractured. Behind Elizabeth's golden age lies a reign of surveillance. Behind the Armada's defeat lies a story of religious wars where ordinary men and women paid the price. This was not a birth of liberty. It was a gamble that chained the island to cycles of repression, rebellion, and blood. And from that gamble came a habit Britain would never abandon: to mask power with principle, to cloak conquest in the language of destiny. If the Tudors forged a monarchy strong enough to command the island, the centuries that followed saw Britain turn its ambitions outward. From the 17th century onwards, Britain's destiny was no longer only an island story. It became a maritime empire, its sails spreading across oceans, its merchants and soldiers carving dominion from the Caribbean to India. This expansion is celebrated as a triumph of ingenuity, industry, and daring. But beneath the rhetoric of discovery and progress lay something darker: conquest, slavery, and exploitation on a scale the world had never seen. The sea was Britain's greatest weapon. Wooden ships crewed by hardened sailors became floating fortresses, carrying not only goods but guns. At first, these ships competed with Spain, Portugal, and the Dutch, vying for control of trade routes in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. But by the 18th century, Britain had become the undisputed master of the oceans. Naval supremacy allowed it to dictate terms of exchange and extend its reach across every continent. At home, this supremacy was presented as civilization spreading its light. Pamphlets and sermons proclaimed that British expansion brought law to lawless lands, trade to stagnant economies, and Christianity to heathen souls. The empire styled itself as a moral force destined to uplift. But the reality on the ground told a harsher story. Nowhere is this contradiction clearer than in the Atlantic slave trade. British ships transported millions of Africans across the ocean in chains. Packed into the suffocating holds of slavers, men, women, and children endured unimaginable horror. Disease, starvation, and cruelty killed vast numbers before they ever reached the plantations of the Caribbean or the American colonies. Those who survived were sold into lives of endless toil, their labor generating the sugar, tobacco, and cotton that enriched Britain's ports and financed its rising industrial power. To claim that this system was merely an unfortunate necessity is to ignore the truth. It was deliberate, calculated, and defended for profit. Liverpool, Bristol, and London became wealthy on slavery's proceeds. Banks, insurers, and traders grew rich from a commerce that treated human beings as cargo. When Britain later abolished the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833, it celebrated the act as a moral triumph. But by then it had already reaped the benefits, and even abolition itself was tainted. The government compensated slave owners for their loss of property with vast sums, while the freed slaves received nothing. India tells another side of the same story. The East India Company, a private corporation backed by the Crown, established trading posts in Calcutta, Bombay, and Madras. Through bribery, warfare, and manipulation, it extended its control inland. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, Britain seized Bengal, one of the richest provinces of the Mughal Empire. Within a few years, famine ravaged the region, killing millions, as grain was diverted to export markets. While peasants starved, British merchants amassed fortunes. Later, railways and canals would be touted as evidence of Britain's civilizing mission. But were they truly built for India's benefit, or to move troops quickly, to extract resources more efficiently, and to consolidate foreign control? The empire also claimed to bring law and governance. Yet its justice was rarely neutral. In Ireland, uprisings were crushed with ruthless force. In Jamaica, after a slave rebellion in 1831, hundreds were executed, their bodies displayed as warnings. In India, the uprising of 1857 was met with massacres on both sides, but Britain's reprisals were infamous for their scale and savagery. In Kenya, during the Mau Mau rebellion of the 1950s, detainees were tortured in camps run by a government that still claimed to represent the highest ideals of liberty. And yet, alongside this brutality, Britain projected itself as the champion of freedom. Its parliament debated rights, its courts shaped common law, its thinkers wrote of liberty and democracy. This contradiction is the heart of Britain's imperial story. At home, the language of liberty flourished. Abroad, liberty was denied to millions. How could the same empire that celebrated the Magna Carta and the Bill of Rights also ship children across the Atlantic in chains? How could a nation that spoke of equality under law rule half the world without granting them the same protections? The defenders of empire argue that it created global trade, that it spread modern institutions, that it left behind infrastructure, education, and governance. They point to railways in India, parliaments in Canada and Australia, and the English language itself as gifts of empire. The critics respond with a different ledger: the destruction of indigenous cultures, the famines of Bengal, the massacres of Amritsar and Croke Park, the dispossession of Aboriginal peoples in Australia, and the Native Americans in North America. For every law, court, or railway, there was a colony stripped of autonomy, a people denied sovereignty, and a society reshaped to serve London's interests. Australia itself embodies this duality. For many British settlers, it was opportunity land, resources, a new life, far from the constraints of home. For Aboriginal Australians, it was catastrophe. Disease, displacement, and violence decimated communities that had lived on the land for tens of thousands of years. Britain called this colonization. The Aboriginal survivors called it invasion. The empire celebrated expansion. Its subjects experienced loss. The contradiction extended even into Britain's self-image. The island saw itself as a defender of balance, ensuring that no single European power dominated. It fought Spain, then France, then Napoleon, later Germany. But the same Britain that spoke of balance abroad claimed supremacy in its colonies, building the largest empire in history. It decried tyranny on the continent while enforcing it overseas. Perhaps the starkest irony lies in the American Revolution. Britain's colonies in North America, inspired by Enlightenment ideals, demanded liberty and representation. They declared independence in 1776 with words drawn from the very traditions Britain itself had cultivated. Britain responded not with compromise but with repression, sending armies to quell the rebellion. The colonies won their freedom, and Britain was forced to confront the hypocrisy. The empire that spoke of liberty had lost to those who demanded it for themselves. By the 19th century, the empire had become a global colossus. The phrase, "the sun never sets on the British Empire," was not mere rhetoric. It was fact. Britain ruled territories on every continent. Its navy enforced the Pax Britannica. Its merchants dictated the terms of global commerce. To the Victorians, this was proof of divine favor, evidence that Britain was chosen to lead. To its critics, it was arrogance masked as destiny, expansion disguised as morality. This contradiction of freedom at home and oppression abroad, of wealth and poverty, of progress and plunder, defines Britain's imperial story. It forces us to ask, was Britain great because it built an empire, or in spite of it? Did the empire spread order and law, or did it spread inequality and violence? When modern Britain remembers its past with nostalgia, waving flags and singing of glory, does it remember the slave ships, the famines, and the gallows, or has it chosen to forget? Greatness, in this chapter of Britain's history, was not a universal experience. For the merchants of London, it was fortune. For the enslaved in the Caribbean, it was chains. For the industrialists of Manchester, it was profit. For the peasants of Bengal, it was starvation. For settlers in Australia, it was new beginnings. For Aboriginal Australians, it was near annihilation. Britain's greatness was never shared evenly. It was always conditional, always shadowed by contradictions too vast to ignore. This is the legacy the empire leaves us, a world forever reshaped by Britain's reach, divided still by the inequalities it entrenched, yet bound together by the language, law, and commerce it spread. Was this truly greatness? Or was it, as some argue, the greatest illusion in British history, the ability to convince itself that power was principle and that conquest was destiny? Britain likes to claim it invented modern liberty, that its parliamentary tradition lit the path for democracies across the globe. In the popular imagination, Britain stands for Magna Carta, for the steady march of constitutional reform, for a unique moderation that avoided the violent extremes of other nations. But the truth is more jagged, more uncomfortable. Britain's liberty was not born in gradual progress, but in blood, betrayal, and contradiction. It was forged in civil wars, sharpened on the axe that severed a king's head and exported abroad only when convenient. The 17th century ripped Britain apart. For generations, the Tudor monarchy had grown stronger, binding church and crown in an iron grip. But by the time of Charles I, the balance of power was cracking. Parliament demanded a voice. Religious disputes festered. The king's arrogance collided with the ambitions of his people. The result was the English Civil War's conflicts that killed more Britons proportionally than the First World War. The rhetoric of the parliamentarians was stirring. Liberty, rights, and the rule of law. But the reality was chaos. Families were torn apart, villages burned, cities besieged. When Charles I was tried and executed in 1649, it was an act unprecedented in European history. A monarch, declared guilty of tyranny, brought to the scaffold by his own subjects. Was this the dawn of freedom, or the ultimate act of rebellion against order? For royalists, it was sacrilege. For radicals, it was justice. For the people in between, it was terror. Oliver Cromwell's republic promised godly rule, but delivered something closer to dictatorship. His armies crushed uprisings in Ireland with massacres so brutal they remain seared into Irish memory. Drogheda and Wexford were not scenes of liberty, but of slaughter, where thousands were put to the sword in the name of God and Parliament. Cromwell spoke of reform, yet ruled through force, suppressing dissent with the same ruthlessness as any king. The free Commonwealth was short-lived, collapsing after his death, and the monarchy was restored in 1660. The so-called Glorious Revolution of 1688 is often portrayed as the moment Britain found its constitutional balance. William of Orange and his wife Mary were invited to take the throne. James II fled, and Parliament declared its supremacy. Liberty, Protestantism, and parliamentary sovereignty triumphed. Or so the story goes. In reality, this was less a popular revolution than an elite coup. Landowners and politicians, fearful of James's Catholicism and absolutist tendencies, replaced him with rulers more pliant to their interests. For the common people, life changed little. The franchise remained narrow. The rights enshrined in the Bill of Rights were carefully limited. Britain did not suddenly become a democracy. It became a constitutional monarchy run by and for the landed class. And yet, even this limited settlement had consequences abroad. Britain's new rulers poured resources into maritime expansion, using parliamentary control to finance the navy and extend trade. Liberty at home translated into power overseas. But here the contradictions widened. The same parliament that boasted of protecting rights oversaw the expansion of slavery. The same Britain that celebrated constitutional balance crushed dissent in Ireland and Wales. Freedom at home, repression abroad. That was the bargain. The colonies in North America were particularly sensitive to these contradictions. Settled by Englishmen who carried with them ideas of rights and liberty, they expected to govern themselves. But as Britain tightened control, demanding taxes without representation, resentment festered. When colonists invoked the principles of English liberty, Britain dismissed them. The empire that claimed to be the mother of liberty treated its colonies as subjects, not partners. In 1776, the Declaration of Independence exposed the hypocrisy. "All men are created equal" was a phrase borrowed from Enlightenment ideals nurtured in Britain. Yet when Americans claimed it for themselves, Britain sent armies to crush them. The empire that prided itself on being freer than France or Spain was unwilling to extend that freedom to its own colonies. The war that followed was not merely a colonial rebellion. It was a global struggle. France, Spain, and the Dutch seized the opportunity to weaken Britain. The Royal Navy, stretched thin, could not maintain dominance everywhere. After Yorktown in 1781, the American cause triumphed, and Britain was forced to acknowledge defeat. The world's greatest empire had lost its most promising colonies. And, at home, the loss prompted soul-searching. Was Britain's greatness slipping? Or was this defeat proof of the contradictions at the heart of its power? The empire spoke of liberty but denied it. It celebrated parliament but refused representation. It proclaimed order but enforced domination. America was a mirror Britain could not bear to look into, for it showed the gap between rhetoric and reality. Yet the defeat was not the end of empire. Britain shifted its focus to Asia, Africa, and the Pacific. The loss of the 13 colonies did not humble the empire for long. If anything, it hardened its resolve to dominate elsewhere. But the lesson lingered. Liberty, once promised, could not be contained. When Britain exported its ideas, it also exported the seeds of its own undoing. This chapter of Britain's history is celebrated as the birth of parliamentary democracy, as a triumph of constitutional moderation over absolutism. But moderation is a myth. The 17th century was drenched in blood. The 18th was marked by rebellion abroad and repression at home. Liberty was won for some, denied to others. Rights expanded for elites, while peasants, Catholics, and colonized peoples remained voiceless. The uncomfortable truth is this: Britain's liberty was always selective. It was born in civil war, preserved by coups, and extended cautiously when it served power. Abroad, it was withheld, even crushed, when it threatened imperial control. Britain exported liberty and only when forced, and even then, grudgingly. So when Britain claims to have given the world democracy, we must ask, did it give it freely? Or did it give it only when its subjects rose in rebellion and demanded it for themselves? The American Revolution was not Britain's gift, it was Britain's failure. And it would not be the last time the empire's contradictions tore it apart. By the 19th century, Britain had ascended to heights no island nation had ever reached. The Royal Navy ruled the oceans. Its factories belched smoke into the skies. Its railways stitched together continents. And its merchants dictated the rules of global trade. Britain styled itself as the workshop of the world, the guardian of balance, and the champion of progress. But the story beneath the triumphal narrative is less glorious. The very forces that made Britain powerful, naval supremacy and industrial revolution, also revealed the darker face of modernity. Mass exploitation, environmental destruction, and the widening gulf between myth and reality. The cornerstone of Britain's dominance was its navy. The Napoleonic Wars had sealed the island's supremacy. At Trafalgar in 1805, Admiral Nelson's fleet shattered Napoleon's hopes of crossing the Channel. His death in victory made him a national saint, a symbol of sacrifice for empire. From that moment until the First World War, Britain's navy would remain unchallenged. Its warships, powered first by wind and later by steam, patrolled every sea, suppressing rivals and securing Britain's empire. To Britons at home, this was security. To the rest of the world, it was coercion. Gunboat diplomacy forced open markets in China, extracted concessions in Africa, and guaranteed that Britain's goods would flow and its profits would swell. This maritime supremacy dovetailed with the greatest transformation in Britain's history, the Industrial Revolution. Fueled by coal, driven by steam, and shaped in iron, it remade not just Britain, but the entire world. Inventions like the spinning jenny, the steam engine, and the power loom revolutionized production. Factories rose across Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow, churning out textiles, steel, and machinery. Railways slashed through landscapes, binding towns into a national economy. Cities swelled, fortunes were made, and Britain's output dwarfed its rivals. Britain celebrated this as progress, the dawn of a new age. But progress for whom? In the slums of industrial cities, the reality was soot, squalor, and suffering. Entire families were crammed into filthy tenements. Children as young as 5 worked in mines and factories, their bodies bent and lungs blackened. Women toiled for starvation wages. Epidemics of cholera and typhus stalked the poor, while the wealthy built mansions on the profits of their labor. The very engines of progress that powered Britain's empire also condemned millions of its own people to misery. The contradictions were glaring. Parliamentarians boasted of freedom, yet Britain's working class endured conditions little better than bondage. The empire prided itself on prosperity, yet Irish peasants starved during the Great Famine of the 1840s while grain was exported abroad. The famine revealed Britain's indifference to suffering when it clashed with ideology. Laissez-faire dogma and prejudice toward the Irish turned a natural disaster into mass death. More than 1 million perished, and another 1 million fled. While London congratulated itself on maintaining economic principle, was this the behavior of a great nation, or the cold cruelty of an empire that valued profit over people? Meanwhile, Britain claimed the mantle of morality by abolishing the slave trade in 1807 and slavery itself in 1833. These acts are still hailed as proof of Britain's humanity. Yet, abolition came only after centuries of profit, when slavery had already enriched Britain beyond measure. And even in ending it, the empire exposed its priorities. Former slave owners received massive compensation, a financial windfall paid by the state. The freed received nothing. Liberty was proclaimed, but injustice endured. The empire expanded relentlessly. Britain colonized Australia and New Zealand, planting settler societies that dispossessed indigenous peoples. It tightened its grip on India, formally bringing it under crown rule after the rebellion of 1857. It fought wars in China to force open markets for opium narcotics pushed on a foreign population for British gain. These were not wars of freedom. They were wars of commerce enforced at cannon's mouth. Yet Britain convinced itself and much of the world that it was spreading civilization. Railways, telegraphs, and schools were presented as proof of benevolence. Missionaries preached the gospel of progress. Politicians proclaimed that Britain bore a civilizing mission. But this rhetoric masked reality. Railways in India moved troops and resources, not simply people. Schools trained clerks to serve colonial administrators. Progress was real, but it was built on subordination. The empire's gifts were never free. They were tools of control, dressed in the language of uplift. At home, industrial might brought its own contradictions. The Reform Acts of the 19th century gradually expanded the franchise, but cautiously, always under pressure from below. Workers and women demanded rights, often facing brutal suppression. The Peterloo Massacre of 1819, when cavalry charged into crowds demanding reform, exposed the state's fear of popular power. Chartists petitioned for universal suffrage, only to be dismissed as radicals. Britain's democracy grew not from the generosity of elites, but from the persistence of struggle. Culturally, Britain celebrated itself as the model of progress. The Great Exhibition of 1851 showcased its industrial marvels beneath the Crystal Palace. Crowds marveled at machines, fabrics, and wonders from across the empire. But hidden behind the glass was the exploitation that made it possible, the labor of miners, the sweat of mill workers, the suffering of colonized peoples. The exhibition was a temple of pride built on foundations of inequality. Even as it dominated, Britain feared decline. The rise of Germany and the United States in the late 19th century threatened its supremacy. Naval races and colonial rivalries strained its resources. The Boer War in South Africa revealed the costs of empire. British troops fought guerrillas in a brutal conflict, resorting to scorched earth tactics in concentration camps, where thousands of civilians died. The nation that claimed to lead the world in humanity had pioneered techniques of collective punishment that foreshadowed the horrors of the 20th century. By the dawn of the 20th century, Britain's paradox was complete. It stood at the height of its power, its empire stretching across a quarter of the globe. The sun truly never set on British dominions. Its navy was supreme, its industry unmatched, its capital the financial center of the world. And yet, within this apparent triumph, cracks were already visible. Inequality at home bred unrest. Colonial subjects demanded autonomy, rivals gathered strength. Britain's greatness was built on foundations that could not last forever. Was Britain's industrial and naval supremacy the proof of its destiny, or the mask of its arrogance? The engines of progress brought invention and wealth, but also poverty and despair. The empire spread railways and law, but also famines and camps. Britain celebrated itself as master of the seas and workshop of the world, yet its mastery depended on exploitation, its workshop on suffering. Greatness, once again, was conditional. It was greatness for the few, purchased at the expense of the many. Britain's command of the seas ensured that its story would dominate the 19th century, but it also ensured that when the tide turned, the collapse would be global, not local. The power that had bound the world together would one day watch that same world unravel, piece by piece. The summer of 1940 has been enshrined in British memory as the moment of ultimate defiance. Alone against Hitler, with Europe conquered and the Luftwaffe darkening the skies, Britain stood on the brink. It was, in Winston Churchill's immortal phrase, the nation's finest hour. That phrase has echoed across decades, repeated in classrooms, documentaries, and political speeches. But how much of it was myth, and how much reality? Was this truly Britain's greatest triumph, or the first unmistakable sign that the empire had passed its zenith and was already in decline? The facts are well known. France had fallen in June 1940. Hitler turned his gaze across the Channel, preparing Operation Sea Lion, the proposed invasion of southern England. To succeed, Germany needed air supremacy. The Luftwaffe launched a relentless campaign against the Royal Air Force, bombing airfields, radar stations, and cities. Between July and October, the skies over southern England became a battlefield. The RAF, outnumbered but aided by radar and fighting over home ground, held firm. Young pilots in Spitfires and Hurricanes, some barely out of school, fought until exhaustion. Churchill immortalized them as the few to whom so many owed so much. London and other cities endured the Blitz, with nightly bombings turning homes to rubble and families to ash. Civilians took shelter in underground stations, emerging each morning to devastation. The story told ever since is one of courage and resilience, A people united, a leader inspiring, a nation standing alone until America and the Soviet Union joined the fight. But the myth conceals as much as it reveals. First, the question of invasion itself. Was Hitler truly capable of conquering Britain? Many historians argue that Operation Sea Lion was never a serious prospect. Germany lacked the naval power to escort an invasion force across the Channel. The Royal Navy, battered but intact, could have destroyed any attempt at landing. The Luftwaffe could terrorize from the skies, but control of the seas remained Britain's. In this view, the Battle of Britain was less the razor's edge of survival than it has been portrayed a struggle that mattered, but one where invasion was more fantasy than imminent reality. Second, the unity of the people. The Blitz has been remembered as a time of national solidarity, the Blitz spirit of Londoners carrying on in the face of bombs. But beneath the rhetoric lay divisions. Looting rose in bombed areas. Black marketeers profited from scarcity. In some neighborhoods, resentment simmered that the wealthy had fled to the countryside while the poor endured destruction. Morale was not unbreakable. It was maintained through censorship, propaganda, and Churchill's oratory as much as through genuine unity. Third, Churchill himself. He is remembered as the indomitable bulldog, the savior of Britain. Yet his record was mixed. He inspired with words, but his strategic decisions were often reckless. His obsession with peripheral campaigns, such as the disastrous defense of Greece, cost lives and resources. His imperial instincts also colored his priorities. During the Bengal famine of 1943, when millions in India starved, Churchill refused significant relief, blaming the famine on local failings while continuing to divert grain to Europe. To Indians, his leadership was not heroic, but callous. The myth of 1940 as Britain's finest hour also conceals the larger reality. Britain was already dependent on others. American supplies, provided first through cash and carry, and then through lend-lease, sustained the island. Without American ships, food, and arms, Britain could not have endured indefinitely. Even as it fought alone, it was leaning on an ally not yet in the war. Britain was no longer the master of its own fate. For Australians, the story of 1940 is bittersweet. They sent pilots to fly in the Battle of Britain and celebrated its victory, but soon faced a more immediate threat: Japan. When Singapore fell in 1942, it exposed Britain's inability to defend its dominions. Australians realized that Britain's finest hour in Europe did not mean protection in Asia. The empire was fracturing even as Churchill proclaimed its resilience. For Germans, the battle revealed the limits of Hitler's ambition. The Luftwaffe could not break Britain, but the German people also endured devastation in kind when the Allies bombed Hamburg, Dresden, and countless other cities later in the war. What Britain remembers as survival, Germany remembers as the beginning of a new age of terror from the sky, one that both sides would inflict on civilians with equal ferocity. And for Americans, the Battle of Britain was a lesson in illusions. Isolationists argued that Britain was doomed, that aid was wasted. Interventionists pointed to Churchill's speeches as proof of a cause worth supporting. But in truth, America was watching the decline of an empire it would soon eclipse. Britain might win battles, but the war would be decided by American industry and Soviet sacrifice. So was 1940 really a triumph? Or was it the moment when Britain shifted from world power to dependent ally? The mythology of the finest hour has obscured the fact that Britain was already on the defensive. Its empire stretched thin, its economy strained, its power reliant on others. The war revealed not Britain's invincibility, but its vulnerability. Yet myths matter. The Blitz spirit became part of Britain's identity. Churchill's words outlasted his failures. The image of the few battling against overwhelming odds remains powerful, even if the odds were never quite as desperate as claimed. Britain needed the myth to survive the war, to hold its empire together for a little longer, and to sustain its self-image in a century where decline was unavoidable. The contradiction is clear. The finest hour was both real and illusion. It was courage and propaganda, resilience and dependence, triumph and warning. It saved Britain from immediate defeat, but it also marked the end of British primacy. The island that once ruled the seas had become a fortress under siege, reliant on allies to endure. The empire survived the Second World War, but it would not survive the peace that followed. So perhaps 1940 was not the beginning of renewed greatness. Perhaps it was the beginning of the end, the moment Britain clung to survival with all its might, and in doing so, revealed that its glory days were already behind it. The Second World War ended with Britain on the victorious side, but victory disguised the reality of exhaustion. The island that had once boasted of ruling the seas was bankrupt, its cities scarred by bombs, its people weary from years of rationing. It had fought fascism and survived, but in doing so, it had bled itself dry. The illusion of empire lingered. Churchill still spoke as though Britain remained the world's arbiter, yet the truth was already clear. The age of British dominance was over. The most glaring sign came in 1947, when Britain granted independence to India. For centuries, India had been described as the jewel in the crown of the empire, the source of prestige, profit, and power. But after the war, Britain no longer had the means to hold it. Nationalist movements, led by figures like Gandhi and Nehru, had grown too strong. The Quit India movement of 1942 had demonstrated the willingness of millions to resist imperial rule. Britain's promises of reform were no longer enough. Independence came swiftly, almost recklessly. The subcontinent was partitioned into India and Pakistan, a hasty decision driven by political expediency rather than careful planning. The result was catastrophic. Communal violence erupted, trains filled with corpses crossed new borders, and more than 1 million people died in the chaos. Britain congratulated itself for relinquishing power peacefully, yet the partition revealed the costs of its hasty withdrawal. The empire had claimed to bring order, but its departure left carnage. India's independence set a precedent. Across Asia and Africa, colonial subjects demanded the same. In Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah called for self-rule. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising exposed the brutality of colonial repression, as detainees were beaten, tortured, and killed in camps run by a government that claimed to embody civilization. In Malaya, counterinsurgency campaigns bled resources. One by one, colonies slipped from Britain's grasp, not with the grace of orderly transition, but through struggle, rebellion, and blood. The empire unraveled not only abroad, but in Britain's own self-image. For generations, Britons had been told they were the rulers of the greatest empire in history. By the 1950s, that identity was collapsing. The Suez Crisis of 1956 drove the point home with humiliating clarity. When Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, Britain, alongside France and Israel, launched a military intervention to seize it back. For a moment, it seemed a return to the old ways, gunboats enforcing imperial will. But the world had changed. The United States and the Soviet Union, the new superpowers, forced Britain to withdraw. The Suez debacle shattered the illusion. Britain could no longer act independently. It had to bend to Washington's will. The empire that once dictated global affairs had been reduced to a pawn in Cold War politics. Newspapers at the time called it a humiliation. Historians since have called it the final confirmation of Britain's decline. At home, decolonization sparked contradictions. On one hand, many Britons were proud of the Commonwealth, presented as a family of equal nations. On the other, immigration from former colonies provoked resentment. The Windrush generation of Caribbean migrants, arriving in the late 1940s and 1950s, faced racism and discrimination. Britain claimed to be inclusive, yet treated its new citizens as outsiders. The empire's legacy was not just independence abroad, but division within. For Australians, the empire's decline was both liberation and betrayal. The fall of Singapore in 1942 had already exposed Britain's inability to defend its dominions. After the war, Australia turned increasingly toward the United States for security, formalized in the ANZUS Treaty of 1951. Loyalty to Britain gave way to pragmatism. For many Australians, the empire's unravelling confirmed what had been clear for years. Britain's promises could no longer be trusted. For Germans, the decline of Britain was a different lesson. Defeated and divided, Germany watched as Britain clung to imperial illusions. Yet, by the 1950s and 1960s, West Germany's economy was recovering rapidly, while Britain's stagnated. The so-called sick man of Europe was not Germany, but Britain, the once proud empire struggling to adapt to a new era. For Americans, the unraveling confirmed their new status. The United States emerged from the war as the dominant Western power. Britain, though still influential, was no longer an equal partner. The special relationship became less a partnership of equals and more a bond between leader and follower. Churchill's rhetoric of shared destiny masked the reality. Britain depended on American loans, American arms, and American power. The contradictions of Britain's post-war story are stark. It proclaimed itself a defender of freedom, yet clung to colonies until forced to release them. It styled itself as a model of tolerance, yet resisted immigration and equality at home. It celebrated its Commonwealth, yet could not prevent its members from drifting toward independence. By the 1960s, the empire that had once spanned a quarter of the globe was gone. Only fragments remained: Gibraltar, Hong Kong, the Falklands, a scattering of islands. Yet even in decline, Britain continued to tell itself stories of greatness. Films, literature, and school books celebrated empire as a noble mission. Nostalgia replaced reality. The nation preferred to remember the pomp of dominion rather than the pain of its loss. But nostalgia could not hide the truth. The empire had collapsed because it was unsustainable. The cost of maintaining colonies outweighed the benefits. The rise of nationalism made rule impossible. The dominance of the United States and the Soviet Union left no room for Britain's illusions of primacy. The unraveling was not a choice. It was inevitable. The uncomfortable truth is that Britain did not give independence generously. It gave it when it had no choice. It did not step back with dignity. It was pushed, and when it left, it often left chaos behind. Partition in India, ethnic conflict in Africa, unresolved disputes in the Middle East. The empire that claimed to bring order ended by sowing disorder. So was this the twilight of greatness, or the exposure of a myth? Britain's empire had dazzled the world, but its collapse revealed that much of its power had always been fragile. It had relied on dominance of the seas, on control of colonies, on the subjugation of others. Once those pillars crumbled, Britain stood revealed not as the master of the world, but as a nation struggling to redefine itself. By the end of the 20th century, Britain had become something new. Not an empire, but a post-imperial state still haunted by imperial memory. The unraveling was complete, but the illusion of greatness lingered. Politicians invoked it, citizens clung to it, and the world remembered it. But the empire itself was gone. Its legacy a mixture of pride and pain, achievement and atrocity. By the late 20th century, Britain no longer ruled an empire. What remained was a smaller nation, stripped of dominions, reduced in global clout, yet still bound to the memories of its former power. The Union Jack no longer flew over vast territories, but its shadow stretched across the world in language, institutions, and unresolved wounds. Britain had survived the fall of empire, but survival was not the same as greatness. The economic reality was grim. Deindustrialization hollowed out the manufacturing heartlands of the Midlands, Wales, and northern England. The cities that once drove the Industrial Revolution, Sheffield, Manchester, Glasgow, were scarred by unemployment and decline. Britain reinvented itself as a service economy, with London at the center of global finance. The skyscrapers of Canary Wharf rose above the Thames, symbols of wealth and speculation, while coal pits closed and communities collapsed. This uneven prosperity revealed a nation divided between glittering capital and forgotten regions. The political fabric also strained. Scotland pressed for greater autonomy, eventually winning devolution. Wales asserted its language and culture with renewed vigor. Northern Ireland descended into decades of violence, the Troubles exposing the bitter legacy of colonialism within Britain's own borders. The Good Friday Agreement of 1998 offered peace, but the fragility of that settlement showed that the empire's ghosts had not vanished. They had come home. Immigration from former colonies reshaped the nation. Caribbean, South Asian, and African communities brought vitality to Britain's cities, yet faced racism, exclusion, and hostility. The Windrush scandal of 2018 revealed how easily Britain could betray those it had once invited, stripping elderly migrants of rights and dignity. The empire's legacy lived on not in pageantry, but in the daily struggles of citizens, whose very presence challenged old notions of identity. Internationally, Britain remained influential, but no longer decisive. It joined the European Economic Community in 1973, tying its fortunes to the continent it had long tried to keep at arm's length. For decades, this uneasy membership defined its politics. Some saw Europe as a prison, others as salvation. In 2016, the Brexit referendum exposed the fracture lines in Britain's identity. Nostalgia for sovereignty, for control, for a myth of independence, clashed with economic pragmatism. The vote to leave was hailed by some as a new beginning. In reality, it revealed a nation haunted by its past, unable to decide if it was a European power, a global trader, or simply an island adrift. The monarchy, once the embodiment of imperial prestige, transformed into a symbol of continuity amid decline. Royal weddings and jubilees attracted global attention, but beneath the spectacle lay unease. Scandals, questions about relevance, and growing Republican sentiment cast doubt on the institution's future. The crown remained, but its aura of unchallengeable authority had faded. Foreign policy mirrored these contradictions. Britain followed the United States into wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, asserting itself as a global actor. Yet these interventions achieved little, exposing the limits of British power. The special relationship with America remained central, but Britain's role was increasingly that of junior partner. The empire had once dictated terms. Now it followed. Culturally, Britain continued to exert influence. Its literature, music, and universities remained world-renowned. The English language became the lingua franca of business and diplomacy. Yet cultural clout masked uncertainty. Was Britain still a leader, or simply a nation trading on its past reputation? The global fascination with Shakespeare, the Beatles, or the BBC did not erase the questions posed by economic decline, regional discontent, and political instability. The contradictions of modern Britain echo those of its past. It celebrates parliamentary democracy, yet struggles with political trust. It proclaims tolerance, yet battles racism and xenophobia. It insists on independence, yet depends on alliances. It clings to myths of greatness, yet grapples daily with the reality of diminished influence. Brexit, more than anything, symbolized this crisis of identity. Advocates spoke of a return to sovereignty, of global Britain reclaiming its role. But what role was that? The empire that once anchored Britain's place in the world no longer existed. The networks of trade and power had shifted. The 21st century belonged to new giants, the United States, China, the European Union, and rising powers elsewhere. Britain's nostalgia for empire collided with the reality of marginality. So what is Britain after greatness? Is it a nation resilient enough to reinvent itself, as it has so many times before? Or is it a nation trapped in memory, clinging to illusions of empire, unable to define its future without reference to its past? The cliffs of Dover still stand, the Parliament still debates, the crown still endures, but the empire is gone, and with it the certainty of destiny. Perhaps Britain's true greatness lies not in conquest or dominion, but in the ability to face the truth of its history, to acknowledge that its liberty was selective, its empire contradictory, its power fleeting, to admit that much of what it celebrated as destiny was, in fact, illusion. Only by confronting these uncomfortable truths can Britain find a path beyond nostalgia. The island remains, battered but alive, its future unwritten. The question is not whether Britain was great, but whether it can live honestly after greatness, no longer ruler of the seas, but a nation among nations, shaped as much by its shadows as by its triumphs.